I'm Dr. Erica Bove, and welcome to the Love and Science podcast. I'm your host, and also the founder of Love and Science, Thriving Through Infertility. I'm so excited you're here today. With over a decade of experience helping thousands of women just like you, I empower professional women to build their families with confidence and compassion. Let's dive in. Hello, my loves, and welcome back to the Love and Science podcast. Today, we're going to talk about something that is very timely because as this episode is being recorded, we are well into the thick of holiday season. And, we think about it as, oh, it's the most wonderful time of the year. But as Glennon Doyle says, it's actually just the most time of the year. So whatever emotions you're feeling most strongly right now, whether it's sadness or hopelessness or frustration, those are the things we feel the most. And when we look around at other people, sometimes we wouldn't have to spend time with people unless we had these family gatherings, etc. It can bring up a lot of these feelings and they can be quite strong. So, I really wanted to talk about triggers and, what are they? What do they represent? And is there anything we can do so that we're not just like a ping pong ball during this holiday season, going from one trigger minefield to the next? But what can we do to create some calm, some steadiness, some grounding so that we can actually enjoy some of this time and not feel like everybody else and their happy news is actually controlling us? So I think the first thing I would say is, and this comes from my mentor, Dr. Kavitha Sun, to think about triggers. And what I mean by triggers is that when we have a physiological response to something that is noxious to us, right? Usually it's an emotional stimulus where we have different physiological things that happen. So like our heart might race, we might feel, heat in our face like I do. Maybe you feel a tightness, maybe you feel, unease. A lot of these things go along kind of like anxious symptoms, but just our whole body revolts against what is happening. And sometimes it's so severe that our frontal lobe even goes offline. It's like, poof, like, the flip has switched and forget it. So that's a trigger. And triggers are usually related to where we need healing the most, right? So say we, more than anything else, want to be pregnant this holiday season and we're not. And somebody else, like an insensitive cousin, announces a pregnancy, like that will hit that spot in a different way, say, than if you actually were in your desired state, which is a pregnant state. That same stimulus would not have the same sting, right? And I understand this in my own life and in many, many ways. And it's trying to say, okay, well, looking at it with a curious lens, like the first step is, okay, so if you're in the middle of a trigger, right? Like, what can you do to re-regulate, to bring yourself back to a sense of calm? And what I do is I sort of take a sense, like take my own temperature, so to speak, my emotional thermometer. And if my own emotional thermometer is greater than a 5 out of 10, then that means there's nothing productive that's going to come from me trying to remain in the situation. And I have to remove myself. And maybe that's just like for a quick bathroom break, or maybe I step outside into the cool winter air. We're very blessed with that in these parts of the world where I am. That kind of gives me a nice, fresh sort of slap in the face sometimes with the nice cold air. Or maybe you're at the beach and you can feel the wind on your face, something that brings you into the moment to say like, okay, I'm not in this situation anymore. I'm going to feel my feet on the ground. I'm going to breathe. I'm going to come into this present moment and, I'm going to be okay. Right. We have to soothe our own nervous system in the moment. And so that's the first thing, is just saying, accepting that triggers are going to happen. And so what do we do in the moment when they are so painful? If it's, if we still feel like we can stay in the situation and breathe and, redirect the conversation or something like that, that's accessible to us. But actually, sometimes it's not. And sometimes it's just so painful that we have to step away. We have to take a break. My own family knows. Sometimes I'll even say, "Hey, I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed. I'm going to step out for a minute." Um, but it just also depends on who you are, what you feel comfortable with, and who the company is. So that's sort of during the trigger. I really do think, though, that, most of the work, probably at least 80%, is trigger prevention and healing. And so, thinking about it, like getting very curious and saying, okay, what are my most common triggers, especially around the holidays? For many people, it might be opening the holiday cards and seeing people's baby announcements or, baby pictures or kid pictures. That can be extremely triggering. For other people, it might be going to a family function and not knowing if somebody's going to announce a new pregnancy. And that can be just sort of very unsettling and can make us hypervigilant and be pretty terrible. Um, for other people, it might be that family member who very well meaning, but just doesn't know where the boundaries are and, ask when are you guys going to have kids, or when's another one coming? And that, in the moment can really throw us off, especially when we don't want to offend anybody, but we also know how painful that is and we don't really have a good answer. For other people, it might be, seeing pregnant people in movies or in stores or in church or baptisms, like, yoga class for me the other day. I was in yoga class and someone was pregnant. Like it's just, it seems like pregnant people are everywhere. And the hardest part is that is what's visible. What is invisible is the 1 in 6 people, the 1 in 4 physicians who are suffering in silence. And so that's the hard part, is like people who are pregnant are very visible, and people who aren't or struggling or having losses, oftentimes we just don't know, right? We think maybe we're the only ones, or, maybe there could be some sort of solidarity if we knew that other people are struggling, but it's really, really hard. So really getting curious and just maybe like making a list and saying, okay, like when do I get most activated? And is there anything I can do to prevent this from happening? So, if we know that there's a gathering and a, friend of a friend is going to be there who's pregnant, like maybe we avoid that gathering if it's, we feel like it's, you know, I wanted to say socially acceptable to do so, but again, part of this is knowing what we need and sometimes doing things that aren't socially acceptable. So that is your own judgment call, but maybe it's avoiding that function if we can, right? Um, another solution that we talk about in our support group is that maybe there's a different family member who's not quite so triggered by the holiday cards. And so maybe, putting them up to the task of opening those and not showing you if they know you well and they know that that's going to upset you. Um, also, who says they need to be opened in the first place? Like, I know that people spend the expense and the thought of sending, et cetera, but I mean, let's be honest, don't most people do those cards for themselves and to show off their families, just like social media does? This is the 5% of my life that I want to show you right now. It's a very filtered existence. And so I maybe it's just me and my healthy cynicism, but I often will look at those holiday cards as like fake news. I'm like, okay, well, maybe this is true like 5% of the time, but what they're not showing is their own pain, their own heartache, their own difficulties most of the time. I mean, if you run in my circles, you're probably pretty authentic and you say it like it is, which I very much appreciate about the village I've cultivated. I try to be one of those people too. My sister too. I love her set sort of brutal honesty, as they say, and her radical candor. But I also think that, like, who says those cards need to be opened? Like, if I knew that by me sending somebody to something, they would open that and that would cause them pain, like, if I knew that ahead of time, I would not send that thing, right? And so just think about it. If your friend or family member knew that by your opening that card, that was going to cause you suffering, I don't think that they would want you to open it. So just think about it. Like, I was saying, like, my brother and his wife are in Peru for the next 6 months, and I'm bringing in their mail sometimes. And the other day I went over there and I brought in their mail, and it was so interesting. Like, they had a bunch of holiday cards, and I thought to myself, they're not going to see these till May, and that's okay. Like, they don't need to. And sometimes we think that there is like this urgency, or we're going to offend somebody else or whatever, but just think about it. Give yourself permission. A lot of these trigger things, trigger prevention stuff is giving yourself permission to do things a little differently. And, I would strongly consider thinking about how those holiday cards are potentially negatively affecting you. Another thought about, sort of stuff that we can do that's in our power. A lot of people this time of year are unsubscribing from group chats or even silencing them. Like, I love the group chat. Don't get me wrong. I have a few of them myself. But sometimes we just need to say no. I call it the buzzing and the beeping. Like, our nervous systems do not do well when they are constantly being interrupted or bombarded, and distracted. And so, perhaps you just start by silencing the group chat. Like, who really needs to know what your second cousin's kids are doing, or your colleagues, family? Like, all of that stuff is just noise, signal to noise. It's noise. It's a distraction. And again, it's the 5% of life that people decide to share. And so I would just think about it, like, what sorts of things in your life are toxic or really hurting you? And would it be the end of the world if you had a different way of dealing with those things? Maybe there's some more power than you think. So some of that is trigger prevention, right? Just sort of knowing what your own triggers are. Maybe it's a family member. Like, this is one of my favorite things to say is, like, if you know that Aunt Bertha is going to ask you, how's it going in terms of trying to get pregnant? Maybe you send Aunt Bertha a text message, the day before the function or the day of, and say, hey, Aunt Bertha, I can't wait to see you. You can even say, my husband and it's taking us a little longer to get pregnant than we thought. Can we please talk about other things and not that tomorrow night or tonight? And just, again, she doesn't necessarily need to respect that. Sometimes people do cross our boundaries, and then we have the opportunity to step away if we want to, but at least it's been preempted. Like, if you're like me, a little type A, I like to preempt things. And, if she does get out of line and slip or ask something, I would just say, you know what? Hey, Aunt Bertha, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of a sore topic. Let's talk about something else. Or even some people don't even say that. They just truly change the subject as if the question had never been asked in the first place. So tell me about your upcoming trip to France. Like, pretend that person never even asked the question. So, again, only these things can only happen if you feel like you're regulated enough to be able to stay in the moment. And it is okay if you feel like you're flooded and that you just have to, like, if you're like me, my fight or flight, reaction sometimes takes over, and mine's the flight. So I got to get out of there. So, hey, if you're not feeling well from that, like, give yourself permission to take a break and see what you need. But again, sometimes preempting some of those situations by avoiding places where there are going to be pregnant people. If you think somebody might make an announcement, try to suss it out ahead of time. It really can be a trigger minefield, and it can be really tough. And we want to have some times that are safe, some good memories this holiday season. And a lot of this, is affected by other people's announcements, which, like I said, I think sometimes we can get a leg up on that if we have a little foresight. What else? So I think that a lot of the benefit, if there is a benefit of getting triggered, if we are interested in growth and self-awareness, which hopefully if you're listening to this podcast, you are, is that we can kind of do a post hoc after the trigger and say, like, why did that bother me so much? Is it like, we can get curious about ourselves? Like, isn't that interesting that when great aunt so-and-so mentioned this, it really kind of set me off. And so, like, what I would say is just get really curious and say, like, isn't that interesting? That really must have, like, struck a nerve because I want something so badly. Or, oh, that reminds me of when I was a child and this thing happened. And I think for some reason, those semi-traumatic events are connected in my mind and my body even, right? The body keeps the score. So just getting really curious. And I think that self-awareness, like, the more we can do the post hoc and say, okay, well, that sucked. I never want to have to experience that again, but how could I change this moving forward? Then the post trigger actually becomes the pre-trigger, and we can use it as part of our prevention strategy. So this takes time, not a ton of time, sometimes even just 5 minutes of journaling, but to really be thoughtful to say, okay, that was very not pleasant. Like, what can I do to make this different going forward? Because let's be real, like, the same things tend to set us off over and over again. And so how can we, respond and not react? How can we remove ourselves from the situation? How can we create a little space, a little pause, so that perhaps in the future, we might be able to handle ourselves differently? Another thing I will say about growth is it is nonlinear. And so sometimes these days, when I handle a situation in a way that I'm really proud of, I actually pat myself on the back and say, myself 6 months ago might not have done it that way. And that's really cool. So sometimes as we're measuring progress too, we can even use our triggers as almost like benchmarks a little bit like, oh, that's great. I wasn't as upset by that. Or, oh, I preempted that in this way and that had a better outcome. Like, again, since our triggers are our raw spots and they show us where we need healing the most, when certain things happen repeatedly over time, we can use that as a measuring stick and just get curious about ourselves. And also as an opportunity for celebration, if we handle and when we handle situations better than we know we would have in the past. What else should we talk about triggers? So I think the biggest thing that I want to impart is to really give yourself some grace because, holidays are a time of grief, of sorrow, of thinking about how we wish things were different than they are. And I don't know a single person, a single evolved person, self-aware person who doesn't have at least some trouble during the holiday season. And maybe it's that they've lost a loved one, or maybe that it's that they wish that they were pregnant, but they're not. Maybe it's that, they've lost a job. Maybe it's that they wanted a promotion that hasn't happened. I don't know. But the holidays, it's like there's all this expectation of joy and cheer and generosity and I think nobody acknowledges, or at least we don't acknowledge enough, the stress and the longing and the grief and the suffering. So, when I think about my own life, at least, and what causes the most suffering, it's when I think that things should be different. So, I do this a lot, in my divorce, right? I think, oh, it shouldn't be this way. And thankfully now I know that when I start thinking that way, that's like a red flag. I'm like, oh, that's not just the pain of the situation, but that's actually imposing an expectation on that and saying like it shouldn't be this way. Like it should be a different way and it's not that way. And so where's that gap? That is the suffering. So that's a caution. If you find yourself thinking that way, learn from my wisdom and just get curious and be like, actually, maybe it should be this way. Like maybe this is my journey. I'm where I am at. I'm making progress. Maybe I'm not where I hoped I would be at this point, but I am learning the lessons I need to. I'm making the village of people who I need to be in my village to move forward. What can I look at and authentically be grateful for? Like I have a lot of support. I have health. I have a good team. Maybe you love your REI. Maybe you love your fertility coach. Maybe you're deciding whether or not to work with a fertility coach and you decide to give that a chance to see if that might get you over that bridge to parenthood. Like whatever it is, be in the moment, be where you are, know that you're okay, know that there will be some inherent pain, but try to notice like, where is there additional suffering when you say it shouldn't be this way and imply that it should be a different way? And trust that every month, every day, every year, we are always moving forward. So I think it's interesting that Christmas and New Year's, they're just like a week apart from each other. And a lot of people do their year in review and reflections. One thing that really helps me is to look back at the previous year and to ask myself, like, what lessons did I learn this year? Obviously the lessons usually come out of the hardship. They usually don't come out of the great stuff. I guess sometimes they do, but oftentimes the great stuff comes out of the hardship too. So it's like life is this crazy soup of all sorts of things that happen to us. They don't happen to us alone. They happen in community. But I look back and say, okay, and if you're listening to this, you're on the fertility journey. What did my fertility journey teach me in 2024? Like, where did I find strength that I didn't know I had strength? Who do I know now that I might not know if I were not on this path? Right. Objectively, where am I now compared to where I was last year? Maybe you're not pregnant yet, although you have more embryos in the freezer than you did this time last year. And, by my standards as an REI, that's forward progress because a lot of the rate limiting step of IVF is generating embryos. So, I would imagine that if you can put self judgments aside and put shame and blame and negativity and self doubt and lack of trust and all those things that we can be plagued with while we're on this path, and just be objective for a second and say, okay, where was I December of 2023 in this journey? Where am I now? What do I know about my body that I didn't know back then? What progress have I made in my fertility journey? Maybe it's been a pregnancy, but a miscarriage. And, I know from personal experience, it is so very difficult. Maybe this point last year, I hadn't been pregnant and I didn't know if I'd ever be pregnant. And now maybe, that I've gotten pregnant. I trust that my body will be able to do that again. I don't know exactly what it is for you, but I promise, like, people in my circles, they don't stand still. They don't move backward. They are always moving forward. And sometimes, like I said, it's not linear. Sometimes it's a spiral. Sometimes it might look a little more jagged if you look at it too closely. But there's always progress. There's always lessons. There's always things that we can be authentically grateful for. And I'm not saying Pollyanna, I'm not saying silver lining. I'm not saying that this doesn't suck and that you don't wish you weren't having to go through this right now, because I affirm all of that. It all makes sense. And at the same time, what helps me sometimes in my darkest moments is really thinking about, like, what am I authentically grateful for? I'm grateful for my amazing family. They're all individuals, different, politically different, personality wise different, many generations, many different walks of life. But I have this huge, amazing family. And when we come together, you know that somebody has your back, that you belong. And I think my parents were cultivating that all these years, but that's something that I'm always grateful for. I'm thankful for, my health. I'm thankful that I can afford good food that's in my refrigerator right now. I'm thankful that I have heat in my home. It's especially important being in the Northeast. I'm thankful that I get to be a doctor and help people every single day along their fertility journeys. And as a coach, hey, a year ago, this year I just celebrated a year of love and science. Like, a year ago this time, we had no babies born yet from love and science. We had just barely started, and the community was just basically in its infancy. It was just starting to grow. And so I think about now that we have this vibrant community, that we have this network of support, we have a lot more collective wisdom. A lot of individual transformations have occurred. We've had babies born, we have ongoing pregnancies, we have, a lot of reasons to celebrate together. And so, I'm reading this book right now. I want to get the title correct. It's like The Gain and the Gap, something like that. It's for this sort of series of classes that I'm doing. And so often we live in the gap, right? However, when we can live in the gain, when we can live in what we actually have and savor those things, doesn't mean we don't keep striving for the things that we want, but we have a different energy, because instead of always hoping that there's there, because spoiler alert, there is no there, we can actually savor the moment. We can turn our attention to what is actually working, the people who love us. And that sort of abundant, beautiful energy is what carries us forward into our dreams, truly. So, I think we started this podcast talking about triggers and how we could make the most of the holiday season, understanding that some triggers will happen. I have a framework for prevention and trigger management in the moment, and then also the kind of the post hoc review. We talked about those things. Those are all very useful strategies. I also think that looking at the big picture, zooming out and just saying, okay, how is this time this year even a little bit better than where I was this time last year? Who do I know? What lessons have I learned? How have I evolved as a human? All those questions as we think about 2024 in whole, and also start to think about 2025. All of that is pertinent to our holiday season, because I know there's spaces of joy. I know there's been moments of connection. I know that there's been aha moments and good news among the bad news, and small wins and even some big wins as well. And at Love and Science, we're here to celebrate all of it, the big, the small, whatever it is. We also provide support during the hard times too, right? Everything's in balance. But for this holiday season, may you stay in the moment when it makes sense to do so. May you process your feelings. May you feel supported and loved. May you feel that you belong. And I wish you nothing but the best for this season, because again, expect it's not all going to be wonderful, right? But know that you have everything you need to be able to handle everything that comes. And you can trust yourself to move on forward in a way that leaves open the possibility for joy and also for your dreams to come to you. So with that, I love you very much. And if I can help you at all in any way this holiday season with something specific or even something general, send me a DM. I love nothing more than to help support people through this time in this journey. I love you until the next time. Bye. Thank you for listening to the Love and Science podcast. I'm so glad you joined us today. If you found this conversation valuable, if you could please rate, review, and share this podcast with your trusted people, it would mean so much to me. If you want more tools to help you navigate the fertility journey, please book a discovery call with me today. The link is in the show notes. Please do not let infertility have the final word. I'm here to take the burden from you so that you can achieve your goal of building your family. In gratitude, this is Dr. Erica Bove. I'm rooting for you always.